Villages appeared along the way, nestled between the this way. It's like seeing it for the first time. Through the most breathtaking landscapes, the villages that was clean, cool, and laced with below the fjords gleamed in the fading light. Their possibility. Lucas slowed the kiss, feeling the weight of the moment between them. The stars were brighter now. He parked the car. His hand stepped out of your life for a moment, where the world feels for. She glanced at Lucas, catching the way the shadows softened his face. I don't know. Being here with you, seeing this. He gestured toward the fjord, the mountain. This, he admitted, his voice barely more than a murk, felt like a bubble of stillness in the vastness, brushing her hand in a slow, steady motion. Too, she said finally, meeting his gaze, and fleeting, as if they were caught in a perfect moment that could strike fjord and mountains behind. The road ahead was dark now, lit only The crisp night air carried a faint scent of pine and wood smoke. I know what you mean. It's hard to believe this is a moment. They stood there, the fire crackling softly behind them. To not worry about the future or the past. Still gentle. She nodded, her smile widening. It's like the world forgot to rush here. Everything will be different after this. Lucas met her gaze, more of a release of tension than anything. Lucas leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Something that, like the fjords and mountains fjord, mingling with the faint smell of their laughter soft against the peaceful backdrop of the fjord. Could stay in it a little longer. Sophie smiled, but hearing Lucas say it aloud made it real. And real conversation easing into more familiar topics. Memory. When they reached the top, the view took Sophie's breath away. Sophie stood at the edge of the overlook. When she turned to look at him, she saw that same look in his preparing for the quiet of night. They walked waters of the fjord. The mountains rose dramatically on either side, their peaks. There was something about this moment, the quiet, the fet. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. To appear, twinkling in the deepening twilight, as Sophie and he cupped her face in his hands, his touching hers in a soft, lingering at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and she couldn't help but smile back, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her window rolled down just enough to let in the crisp afternoon air, the smell of pine and salt water blending as they left the coastal town behind. The sun, beginning its slow descent, bathed the world in a soft golden glow. It was the kind of light that made everything feel vivid, as if the edges of reality were slightly sharpened. Lucas was focused on the road, but even he couldn't resist glancing out at the view every so often, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell the scenery had cast over them. Sophie nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels guarding the fjords. "It feels like a painting," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on the cool glass of the window. "Like it can't be real." The road hugged the edge of the fjord, curving around steep cliffs and dipping into valleys that opened up like secrets. Villages appeared along the way, nestled between the hills and the water, their houses painted in reds, yellows, and whites, each one looking as though it had been placed there with careful hands. Small gardens bloomed in front of them, the last flowers of summer still hanging on, as if they too were reluctant to let go of the light. As they passed a particularly stunning stretch of the fjord, the water below them shimmered, reflecting the soft pastels of the sky. The surface was so still it looked like glass. Lucas slowed the car slightly, as if to give the moment the reverence it deserved. "I always forget how beautiful this drive is," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Every time I come this way, it's like seeing it for the first time." Sophie turned to look at him, catching the way the light touched his face, casting shadows that made his features seem deeper, more serious. She wondered how many times he had made this drive and how it felt to him now, with her beside him. For her, it was the first time, and there was something magical about experiencing it with him, in this particular moment, when the world seemed to slow down and open up in all its beauty. The towns passed by in a gentle blur, each one like a new chapter in a story they were writing together. Small white churches with tall spires stood proudly at the heart of each village, their steeples reaching toward the sky. Children played outside, their laughter carried on the breeze, while elders sat on porches, watching the sun dip lower, as if it were a ritual they'd known all their lives. The light began to soften further, turning from gold to a deeper amber as they neared Nordfjordeid. The fjord on their right had taken on a darker hue, reflecting the last rays of sunlight as they skimmed the tops of the mountains. Sophie felt a quiet excitement growing in her chest, like something important was about to happen, though she couldn't quite put it into words. "Almost there," Lucas said, his eyes flicking toward her with a warmth that sent a flutter through her. His hand moved from the steering wheel for a moment, brushing lightly against hers, as though the simple touch could anchor them in this moment. She smiled at him, feeling the quiet promise between them, and turned her gaze back to the road ahead, where the mountains seemed to part, inviting them deeper into their world. It wasn't just the destination, she realized, but the journey. The miles of road winding through the most breathtaking landscapes, the villages that whispered stories of lives lived here for centuries, the fjords that seemed to hold secrets in their depths. And in the golden light of this late afternoon, with Lucas beside her, it all felt like the beginning of something new, something beautiful. As they continued along the narrow, winding road, the sun began to sink lower, its rays casting long shadows across the landscape. Sophie leaned back in her seat, her eyes following the way the light spilled over the tops of the trees and brushed the distant mountains. The sky above shifted from pale gold to a soft lavender, and the clouds glowed with the last remnants of the day, like embers slowly fading. Lucas had rolled down his window, letting the fresh air sweep through the car. It carried the scent of the fjord, clean, cool, and laced with a hint of wood smoke from the distant cottages they passed. There was something comforting about it, as if the air itself was alive with stories of the land, of people who had traveled this way before them. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to live here?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice quiet but thoughtful. She turned to face Lucas, catching the way his profile looked against the backdrop of the setting sun. He had the kind of calm presence that made the idea of living in such a serene place seem possible, almost inevitable. Lucas glanced at her with a half smile, as if the question had caught him off guard, but pleasantly so. "Here? In the middle of nowhere?" he teased, though there was a softness in his eyes that told her he wasn't dismissing the idea entirely. "Maybe. It's peaceful at least. No rush, no noise, just this." He gestured toward the open landscape, the mountains and fjords that seemed to stretch on forever. Sophie nodded, understanding the appeal. There was a sense of timelessness here, as though the world moved at a slower pace, allowing you to savor each moment. For someone who had always felt caught in the hustle of life, the idea of staying in a place like this, even just for a while, was strangely alluring. As they drove on, the road climbed higher into the hills, offering them views that took Sophie's breath away. Below, the fjords gleamed in the fading light, their surfaces as smooth as mirrors. Tiny boats dotted the water, barely moving, as if suspended in time. Here and there, a house stood alone on a hilltop, its windows glowing faintly like a beacon in the growing dusk. It was the kind of scene that made you feel small, but in a comforting way, as if the world was reminding you of its vastness, its beauty, and how little you needed to be happy. Sophie couldn't help but think of her life back in the city, the deadlines, the constant noise, the feeling that there was never enough time. Here, time seemed to stretch, like the roads winding ahead of them, unhurried and full of possibility. Lucas slowed the car as they approached a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow stretch of the fjord. On the other side, a cluster of houses nestled close together, their roofs dusted with the first hints of evening frost. A family stood outside, waving to them as they passed, their laughter faint but warm in the still air. "That's what I love about these places," Lucas said, glancing at the family. "Everyone's connected. It's like they all know each other, like the mountains. The fjords, they bring people together in a way you don't see anywhere else." Sophie smiled, thinking about how different that was from the anonymity of city life. "Do you think they ever get lonely out here?" she asked, the question more for herself than for Lucas. He was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe, but I think they find joy in the simple things, in the seasons changing, in the quiet, in having people they care about close by." The road ahead curved again, leading them deeper into the valley. The mountains rose higher on either side, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the soft purples and pinks of the evening sky. For a moment, Sophie felt a pang of something, a longing perhaps, for the kind of life that allowed you to notice the beauty in these small, quiet moments. She didn't know if it was the place, or Lucas, or the two of them together, but it felt like something was shifting inside her, like a door was opening to a world she hadn't considered before. As they neared Nordfjordeid, the landscape began to flatten, and the fjord widened, stretching out before them like a vast, still lake. The town was small, nestled between the water and the mountains, its lights beginning to twinkle as the last of the daylight slipped away. Lucas pulled the car into a quiet overlook just outside town, cutting the engine. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath as the sky deepened into a rich indigo, the stars just beginning to peek through. The fjord below reflected the last colors of the sunset, a shimmering palette of blues and violets. Sophie turned to Lucas, feeling the weight of the moment between them. There was something unsaid in the air, something that had been growing since they left Florø, unspoken but undeniable. He looked at her, his eyes catching the soft light of the sky, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks for coming with me," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sophie smiled, her heart beating a little faster. "I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else." And in that moment, she realized it was true, not just for the journey they had shared today, but for something deeper. Something that felt like the beginning of a story neither of them had expected to write. The stars were brighter now, their light dancing on the surface of the fjord like diamonds scattered across velvet. The silence between them was heavy with meaning, filled with everything they hadn't yet said. Sophie felt the quiet tension, her pulse quickening as the night deepened around them. Lucas, sitting so close yet still seeming far away in thought, hadn't moved since he parked the car. His hand rested on the steering wheel, fingers drumming lightly, a rhythm that mirrored her own heartbeat. For a moment, Sophie wanted to break the silence, to say something, anything, to dissolve the weight of whatever was hanging between them. But words felt inadequate. Instead, she gazed out at the fjord, at the reflection of the stars and the distant glow of Nordfjordeid, which shimmered like a village from a fairy tale, tucked safely between mountains and water. "Do you think we're meant to find places like this?" Sophie finally asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. "Places that make you feel like you've stepped out of your life for a moment, where the world feels quieter, slower, more real?" Lucas turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on her, his expression softened, as if her words touched something deep inside him. "Maybe," he said after a pause. "Or maybe it's places like this that help us find ourselves." Sophie let the thought hang in the air, turning it over in her mind. The quiet, the beauty of the fjords, the simplicity of the landscape. It all felt like a reflection of something deeper, something she hadn't realized she'd been searching for. She glanced at Lucas, catching the way the shadows softened his face, his jawline traced by the faint light of the moon now rising over the mountains. "Do you ever feel like you're not really living?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Like, you go through the motions of life, but it's only in moments like this, when everything slows down, that you realize there's so much more you've been missing?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze returning to the fjord. Sophie watched him, her heart caught in the vulnerability of the question. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about the night, the intimacy of the car, and the breathtaking world around them had opened her up in a way she hadn't expected. Lucas finally exhaled a long, thoughtful sigh before turning to face her. "All the time," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. "I've spent years chasing things I thought I wanted, success, stability, a plan for the future. But lately, I don't know, being here with you, seeing this." He gestured toward the fjord, the mountains, the endless sky. "It feels different. Like maybe there's more to life than I thought. Something simpler but more real." Sophie's breath caught at his words. It was as if he had taken the thoughts straight from her mind, the unspoken longing she had carried with her for so long. She had always been a planner, someone who measured her days by what came next, another project, another goal. But here, in this place, everything seemed to stand still, allowing her to feel fully present for the first time in years. Lucas reached across the small space between them, his hand finding hers. His touch was warm, steady, and when their fingers intertwined, Sophie felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. It was more than attraction. This was something deeper, something that had been growing between them, quietly, ever since they'd started this journey. "I don't know where we're going," Lucas said, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. "But I'm glad you're here with me. It feels like I'm not alone in this." Sophie swallowed hard, her heart swelling with the weight of his words. She felt the same, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing until now. Sitting beside him, with the world laid out before them in all its quiet splendor, everything felt possible. The road ahead wasn't about destinations or plans. It was about something else entirely, about being open to whatever came next, together. For a long moment, they sat in that silence, their hands clasped, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The night had fully settled in, the stars above them gleaming like promises whispered in the dark. Sophie finally turned toward Lucas, her eyes meeting his in the soft glow of the moonlight. "Maybe that's the point," she said quietly, her voice steady now. "Not knowing exactly where we're going, but being willing to see what happens. Maybe that's what we've been missing all along." Lucas smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I think you're right." There was a pause, a heartbeat of shared understanding, before he leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin as he whispered, "Let's keep going, Sophie. Let's see where this road takes us." And before she could answer, before her mind could race with the 1,000 questions she normally would have asked, he kissed her, softly at first, as though testing the waters. But then, as the moment deepened, so did the kiss. Unhurried, tender, and full of the promises neither of them had spoken yet, but both understood. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, the world outside the car forgotten for now, as they let go of the past and stepped fully into the unknown together. The kiss lingered, soft and unhurried, like the wind that gently caressed the fjord below. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie felt as if the world had shifted ever so slightly. Everything around them, the quiet mountains, the shimmering fjord, the distant lights of Nordfjordeid, seemed both more vivid and more distant, as though they were suspended in their own private world. Lucas stayed close, his forehead resting gently against hers. His breath mingled with hers, warm in the cool night air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary, maybe even inadequate. The connection between them had deepened without explanation, as if their shared journey had led them to this point for a reason. Sophie let her eyes close, savoring the warmth of Lucas's hand still wrapped around hers. In the stillness of the night, she could hear the distant rush of water down the mountain, the hum of the wind through the trees, and the soft sound of his breathing. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. "Are you okay?" Lucas whispered, his voice laced with concern but also something else. Tenderness, maybe, or the same sense of wonder she felt. Sophie opened her eyes and smiled softly. "I am," she whispered back, "more than okay." He pulled back slightly to look at her, searching her face as if trying to read her thoughts. His brow furrowed just for a moment, and she could tell he was still processing everything that had passed between them. "I wasn't expecting this," he admitted, his voice barely more than a murmur. "You and me, I didn't think." Sophie put a finger to his lips, silencing him gently. "Neither did I," she said. "But maybe we don't have to know exactly what this is right now. Maybe it's enough that we're here, that we found this moment." He smiled at her, his eyes softening with understanding. "You're right," he said. "I'm just glad we found it." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her, deeper than the chill of the evening. It wasn't just the kiss or the way Lucas had looked at her, but something else. An awareness that, for the first time in a long time, she was living fully in the present. There were no distractions, no lingering thoughts of what she should be doing or where she should be going. Just the two of them, the road, and the quiet beauty of the Norwegian fjords. The car, still parked on the overlook, felt like a bubble of stillness in the vastness of the landscape. Sophie turned her gaze back to the fjord below, where the moonlight glistened on the water's surface, turning it silver. The village of Nordfjordeid lay in the distance, its lights flickering like stars nestled between the hills, but it felt a world away from where they were now. "I could stay here forever," Sophie said quietly, the words slipping out before she had a chance to second-guess them. Lucas chuckled softly, his thumb brushing her hand in a slow, steady motion. "If only we could." Sophie smiled but felt a small tug in her chest. There was something about this night, about this place, that made her wish time could stand still. But she knew, even in moments like this, the world kept moving, and soon enough, reality would creep back in. She glanced over at Lucas, who seemed lost in thought, staring out at the water, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered what was going on behind those eyes. "Do you think this will change things?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Lucas turned to her, his eyes searching hers again. He seemed to hesitate before answering, as if weighing his words carefully. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but I think it's a good change, don't you?" Sophie considered that for a moment. Change had always been something she feared, something she avoided. But here, now, with Lucas, it didn't feel so daunting. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. "I think so too," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "But I guess we'll have to see, won't we?" He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Yeah, we will." They stayed there for a while longer, watching the stars slowly brighten as the night deepened. Time felt both infinite and fleeting, as if they were caught in a perfect moment that could stretch on forever. But at the same time, knowing that eventually, they would have to leave this place and face whatever came next. Finally, Lucas shifted in his seat, glancing at the dashboard clock. "We should probably get going," he said, though there was reluctance in his voice. "It's getting late." Sophie nodded, though she wished they could stay just a little longer. "Yeah, you're right." He started the car, the engine rumbling softly to life, and they pulled away from the overlook, leaving the view of the fjord and mountains behind. The road ahead was dark now, lit only by the car's headlights and the faint glow of the moon. Sophie watched as the village of Nordfjordeid grew closer, the twinkling lights of houses coming into clearer focus. As they drove into the quiet town, the streets nearly empty, Sophie felt a mix of emotions, excitement, uncertainty, and a quiet contentment she hadn't expected. Whatever had started between them wasn't something she could easily define, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this was one of those things that didn't need a label, at least not yet. Lucas parked the car near the small hotel where they would be staying for the night. He turned to her, his expression soft, a hint of something unspoken in his eyes. "Let's see what tomorrow brings," he said, his voice gentle. Sophie smiled, her heart light and full. "Yeah," she said softly. "Let's." And as they stepped out of the car and into the quiet night, hand in hand, Sophie couldn't help but feel that whatever tomorrow brought, it would be something worth holding on to. The quiet of Nordfjordeid wrapped around them like a soft blanket as they walked toward the small hotel. The town was nestled between the mountains and the fjord, its streets illuminated by the warm glow of lampposts. The crisp night air carried a faint scent of pine and wood smoke, the kind of peaceful stillness that felt like the world was taking a deep breath. Lucas held Sophie's hand firmly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm as they approached the hotel entrance. There was something unspoken between them now, something that hung in the air, heavier than before. Sophie felt her heartbeat quicken with every step they took, the events of the day swirling in her mind. The drive, the sunset, the kiss, and the quiet certainty that something had shifted between them. The hotel was small and charming, with white wooden walls and flowers blooming in window boxes, even this late in the season. Soft yellow lights glowed from inside, and as they entered, the warmth of the lobby greeted them like a hug after the chill of the night outside. The receptionist, a kind woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, gave them a welcoming smile as she handed over the keys. "Room 12, up the stairs and to the right," she said warmly. "Sleep well. The fjords have a way of giving you the best dreams." Sophie smiled at her words, though she already knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, not after the way the night had unfolded. She followed Lucas up the narrow staircase, the sound of their footsteps muted on the thick carpet. Everything felt surreal, like a dream she hadn't quite woken from yet. When they reached the door to their room, Lucas hesitated for a moment, his hand on the key. He turned to Sophie, his eyes searching hers, as if silently asking if she was okay. She nodded, offering him a small, reassuring smile. He unlocked the door and they stepped inside. The room was cozy, with wooden beams across the ceiling and large windows overlooking the fjord. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the space. There were 2 twin beds pushed together, their white linen covers looking inviting after the long day. Sophie moved to the window, drawn to the view. The fjord lay below, its surface like black glass under the night sky. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting a silver glow across the water. It was so beautiful, so quiet, that she felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of the day, the beauty of the landscape, the intimacy she had shared with Lucas, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, pressed on her all at once. Lucas joined her at the window, standing close but not touching her. She could feel his presence beside her, steady and grounding, even as her thoughts spiraled in 1,000 different directions. "You're quiet," he said softly, his voice low and calm. Sophie didn't look at him right away. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill her lungs before speaking. "It's just everything. This place, this night. It feels like a dream." He was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I know what you mean. It's hard to believe this is real." Sophie finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "What do we do now, Lucas?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "This. Whatever's happening between us, what does it mean?" Lucas's expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, careful, as if he was afraid of breaking the moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want it to end." Sophie's heart skipped at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a quiet determination that made her feel safe, like they were in this together, whatever this was. "Neither do I," she said, her voice steady now. For a long moment, they stood there, the fire crackling softly behind them, the moonlight reflecting off the fjord, and the stillness of the night wrapping around them. It was as if the world had paused, giving them this one perfect moment to figure out what came next. Lucas moved closer, his hand resting lightly on her waist. "Sophie, I didn't expect any of this. I wasn't looking for it, but now that it's here, I can't stop thinking about you. About us. This whole day, it's like something clicked into place. Do you feel it too?" Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, I do. But it's all happening so fast. I don't want to mess this up." "You won't," Lucas said softly, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. We don't have to have all the answers right now. Let's just be in the moment." Sophie's eyes softened at his words, and she felt her worries slowly melt away. Being with Lucas felt right in a way she hadn't expected. The road ahead might be uncertain, but here, in this quiet town by the fjord, it felt like they had all the time in the world to figure it out. She leaned in, resting her head on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath her cheek. Lucas's arms wrapped around her, holding her close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie allowed herself to simply be, to not worry about the future or the past or what might happen tomorrow. All that mattered was this moment, standing by the window with Lucas, the world outside quiet and beautiful. After a while, they broke apart, Lucas's hand still lingering at her waist as he smiled softly. "We should probably get some sleep," he said, though there was a reluctance in his voice, as if he didn't want the night to end. Sophie smiled, nodding. "Yeah, we probably should." They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, the weight of the day finally catching up with them. As Sophie slipped under the cool sheets, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The kind that only comes when you finally let go of the need to control everything. Lucas turned off the light, and the room was bathed in the soft glow of the fire, the only sound the crackling of the flames and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. "Good night, Sophie," Lucas whispered from the bed beside hers, his voice laced with warmth and a quiet promise. "Good night, Lucas," she whispered back, her eyes drifting closed as sleep began to pull her under. And as she lay there, the warmth of the fire and the gentle presence of Lucas beside her, Sophie realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Whatever it was, she knew they would face it together. The morning came gently, with the soft light of dawn creeping through the curtains, casting a golden hue across the room. Sophie stirred under the blankets, slowly waking to the sound of birds chirping outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the fjord, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the events of the night before came rushing back. Lucas, the kiss, the quiet intimacy they had shared. Her heart fluttered at the memory, a warmth spreading through her chest. She opened her eyes fully, turning to look at Lucas, who was still asleep in the bed beside hers. He lay on his back, his face relaxed, the morning light highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the soft curve of his lips. He looked peaceful, and Sophie felt a surge of affection for him, so sudden and so deep that it caught her off guard. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and slipped out of bed. The wooden floor was cool under her feet as she padded over to the window. Pulling the curtains back just a little, she looked out at the view that had enchanted her the night before. The fjord stretched out in front of her, its surface glassy and still, reflecting the towering mountains that rose on either side. The village was slowly waking, a few lights flickering in the distance, smoke rising lazily from chimneys. It was breathtaking, a scene so peaceful that it made Sophie's heart ache with how perfect it felt. She had never imagined a place could feel so much like a sanctuary. As she stood there, gazing out at the landscape, she felt Lucas stir behind her. She heard the rustle of blankets, the soft sound of his breathing shifting as he woke. A moment later, his footsteps padded across the room, and she felt him come up beside her, his presence warm and comforting. "Morning," he said softly, his voice husky with sleep. Sophie turned to face him, smiling. "Morning," she replied, her heart doing that little skip again at the sight of him. He ran a hand through his tousled hair, blinking against the light streaming in from the window. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his voice still gentle. She nodded, her smile widening. "Better than I have in a long time." Lucas's gaze followed hers out the window, and he let out a low, appreciative hum. "It's beautiful, isn't it? Almost feels unreal." Sophie leaned her head against the window frame, her eyes softening as she looked out at the fjord. "Yeah. It's like the world forgot to rush here. Everything just breathes." Lucas turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that," he said quietly. "About how this place makes everything feel different. Slower, calmer. Like we've stepped out of time." Sophie nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The world outside this small village felt distant, as if the everyday worries and stresses of life couldn't reach them here. And standing beside Lucas, the events of the past day felt even more significant. She wasn't sure what had changed between them, but she knew it was something real, something she didn't want to lose. "Do you think we'll be able to take this feeling with us?" she asked, her voice tentative. "When we leave." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the fjord. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's enough that we found it here, even if just for a little while." Sophie looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She wanted to believe that what they had found wouldn't just fade away when they returned to their normal lives. She wanted to believe that the connection they had shared was something deeper than just the beauty of the landscape or the magic of the night. She stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. Do you think we'll be different after this?" Lucas met her gaze, and there was a softness in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I think this place has a way of showing you what really matters." Sophie swallowed, her fingers lightly tracing the fabric of his shirt. "And what about us? What does this mean for us?" Lucas took a deep breath, his hand reaching up to cup her face gently. "I don't have all the answers, Sophie. But I know I want to figure it out with you. I want to see where this goes, even if we don't have a map." Her heart fluttered at his words, a warmth spreading through her that chased away any lingering doubts. She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his for any trace of hesitation. But all she found was sincerity, a quiet promise that he was in this with her, wherever it might lead. Sophie let out a soft laugh, more of a release of tension than anything. "No map, huh? That sounds a little terrifying." Lucas smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. "Maybe. But sometimes the best journeys are the ones where you don't know exactly where you're going." She smiled back, her heart lightening with the realization that she didn't need to have everything figured out right now. For the first time in a long time, she felt free to just be. to let things unfold without trying to control them. "I guess we'll just have to see what happens," Sophie said softly, her eyes locked on his. Lucas leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Yeah," he whispered against her skin. "We will." They stood there together, watching the sun rise higher over the fjord, the light casting long shadows across the water. The world outside the window was vast and beautiful, full of possibilities, just like whatever lay ahead for them. As they finally pulled away from the window, preparing to start the day, Sophie couldn't help but feel that they had already begun something. Something that, like the fjords and mountains around them, would stand the test of time. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. The day unfolded slowly, like the morning mist lifting from the fjord. After breakfast, Sophie and Lucas decided to explore the village, their footsteps quiet on the cobblestone streets. Nordfjordeid had an unhurried charm, with its colorful houses lining the waterfront, their reflections shimmering on the still waters. The air was crisp but not cold, carrying the scent of pine and salt from the fjord, mingling with the faint smell of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. They walked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, but neither of them making a move to take the other's hand. The night before had left them in a delicate space, both of them aware of the change, but unsure how to navigate it in the daylight. Sophie's heart felt light though, like a weight she hadn't noticed had been lifted, and she found herself smiling more than she expected. "Let's check out that little cafe," Lucas suggested, nodding toward a quaint building with a wooden sign that read Café Eidfjord. It sat at the corner of a narrow street, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. A couple of locals sat outside, sipping coffee and chatting, their laughter soft against the peaceful backdrop of the fjord. Sophie nodded, grateful for the suggestion. She needed a bit of normalcy to ground herself, to steady the rush of emotions she hadn't quite sorted through yet. They entered the cafe, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries enveloped them in a comforting warmth. They found a corner table by the window, offering a perfect view of the fjord and the mountains beyond. The sunlight glinted off the water, making it look like a sea of diamonds. Sophie took a deep breath, letting the calm of the scene settle her nerves. Lucas ordered 2 coffees, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The coziness of the cafe contrasted with the vastness outside, as if the small space held its own little world. Sophie traced the rim of her coffee cup, watching the steam rise from it. "It feels like we're in another time here, doesn't it?" she said softly. "Like the outside world can't touch us." Lucas glanced out the window, nodding slowly. "Yeah. It's like this place is its own little bubble, untouched by everything else." He looked back at her, his eyes searching. "I kind of wish we could stay in it a little longer." Sophie smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "Yeah, me too." She sipped her coffee, savoring the warmth, then set it down. "But eventually we'll have to go back, won't we?" Lucas's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he sighed. "Yeah, we will, but maybe we don't have to go back the same way we came." His voice was thoughtful, as if he was considering something deeper than just the journey back. Sophie tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his fingers playing absent-mindedly with the handle of his cup. "I mean this trip. It's changed things, hasn't it? Between us, I mean. I don't want to pretend like nothing happened when we leave. I don't want to go back to whatever we were before." Sophie's heart skipped at his words. There it was, the conversation she'd been both anticipating and dreading. She had known since last night that something had shifted between them, but hearing Lucas say it aloud made it real. And real meant they had to figure out what came next. She looked down at her cup, her thoughts swirling like the steam rising from the coffee. "Neither do I," she admitted quietly. "But I don't know what this is yet. Everything's happening so fast, and I don't want to ruin what we have by rushing into something." Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring. "I don't want to rush either," he said softly. "But I also don't want to ignore what's right in front of us. I feel like there's something real here, Sophie. Something worth exploring." Her heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze. There was sincerity in his eyes, a quiet confidence that made her feel safe. She didn't know what the future held, but sitting there with Lucas, she realized she didn't need to know all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to take things one step at a time. "I feel it too," she said, her voice steady despite the flurry of emotions inside her. "But let's not put pressure on it. Let's see where it takes us, okay?" Lucas smiled, relief and something else, something brighter, flickering across his face. "Okay," he agreed. "One step at a time." They lingered in the cafe a little longer, their conversation easing into more familiar topics, memories from their trip, shared stories of their lives before this journey. The weight of the unknown lifted as they talked, replaced by the comfort of their friendship, now laced with the promise of something more. After finishing their coffee, they decided to explore more of Nordfjordeid. The village was quiet, its streets lined with quaint shops and houses painted in soft pastel colors. The locals smiled as they passed, giving a friendly nod or wave as if welcoming them into this peaceful corner of the world. As they wandered through the streets, Lucas pointed to a trail that led up a small hill overlooking the fjord. "Want to check that out?" he asked, a playful gleam in his eyes. Sophie grinned, nodding. "Lead the way." The trail was narrow and winding, bordered by tall pines and dotted with patches of wildflowers. They walked in companionable silence, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air smelled of earth and greenery, fresh and invigorating. When they reached the top, the view took Sophie's breath away. Below them, the fjord stretched out in all its glory, the mountains framing it like something out of a dream. The water shimmered under the midday sun, and in the distance, the village looked like a scattering of tiny, colorful dots. Sophie stood at the edge of the overlook, letting the beauty of the scene wash over her. She felt Lucas come up beside her, his presence steady and comforting. "This is incredible," she whispered, her eyes wide with awe. "Yeah," Lucas agreed softly. "It is." They stood there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just taking in the vastness of the fjord and the mountains beyond. There was something about the stillness that made Sophie feel small in the best way, like she was part of something bigger than herself, something timeless. Lucas shifted beside her, and when she turned to look at him, she saw that same look in his eyes, the one that made her heart flutter every time. He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "This," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I want more moments like this, with you." Sophie's heart swelled at his words, a warmth spreading through her. She didn't know what the future held, but standing there with Lucas, hand in hand, the fjord stretching out beneath them, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Sophie and Lucas descended the hill, the warmth of the day slowly giving way to the cool embrace of evening. The light cast long shadows across the village, painting everything in a golden glow, as if the world itself was preparing for the quiet of night. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps soft on the path, but there was no awkwardness between them. Sophie's hand still rested in Lucas's, his grip gentle yet firm, a silent promise of the connection they were beginning to build. As they reached the edge of the village, Lucas turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft amber light of the setting sun. "I was thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, "maybe we could take the long way back to the hotel. There's something I want to show you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Another hidden gem?" she teased, her lips curving into a smile. Lucas chuckled, his eyes sparkling with that familiar mischief she had grown to love. "Something like that. Trust me, you'll love it." Sophie smiled, feeling a flicker of excitement rise in her chest. "Lead the way." They walked toward the far end of the village, following a narrow path that led through a patch of trees. The sound of the fjord lapping gently against the shore was their only companion as they made their way through the quiet woods, the soft light filtering through the branches overhead. After a few minutes, they emerged from the trees and stepped onto a small rocky beach. Sophie gasped softly at the sight in front of her. The beach was secluded, hidden from the village by the forest, and stretched out in a crescent shape, bordered by the calm waters of the fjord. The mountains rose dramatically on either side, their peaks glowing in the fading sunlight. The water was so still it looked like a mirror, reflecting the oranges and pinks of the sky above. "It's perfect," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Lucas smiled beside her, his gaze soft as he watched her take it all in. "I found this place the last time I was here. I've never seen anyone else around. It feels like our own little world." Sophie's heart swelled at the thought. "It really does," she said softly, turning to face him. "Thank you for bringing me here." Lucas shrugged, a playful glint in his eyes. "I had a feeling you'd like it." They stood at the water's edge, the cool breeze from the fjord rustling Sophie's hair. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a chill. But there was also a warmth spreading through her chest that came from more than just the beauty of the place. Lucas moved closer, his voice low and gentle. "Cold?" "A little," she admitted with a smile. Without a word, Lucas shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The simple gesture made Sophie's heart flutter. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself, feeling the lingering warmth from his body, and looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. There was something about this moment, the quiet, the fading light, the closeness between them, that felt almost sacred. Sophie's thoughts swirled as she realized just how much Lucas had come to mean to her, not just on this trip, but in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "You know," Lucas said softly, breaking the silence, "when we first left Florø, I didn't expect any of this. I mean, I knew this trip would be beautiful, but I didn't expect to feel this way." Sophie's heart skipped at his words, her pulse quickening. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" Lucas hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he was trying to find the right words. "I mean, I didn't expect to feel so connected to you. It's like, somewhere along the way, I stopped just seeing you as my friend. It feels like more." His words hung in the air between them, and Sophie felt her breath catch. The rush of emotions she had been feeling all day suddenly surged to the surface, and she realized she had been feeling the same way. Every stolen glance, every gentle touch, had been leading them to this moment. Sophie looked up at him, her heart in her throat. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I've been trying to make sense of it, but the truth is, I don't want to fight it anymore." Lucas's eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her, closing the distance between them. His hand reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing her skin. "Neither do I," he said quietly. For a long moment they stood there, the world around them fading into the background. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of Lucas's hand on her cheek, the intensity of his gaze, and the undeniable pull between them. Sophie's heart raced as Lucas leaned in slowly, his breath warm against her skin. Her eyes fluttered closed, and then, in the soft light of the setting sun, their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters of this new, uncharted territory. But then it deepened, and Sophie felt a surge of warmth spread through her, like everything inside her was waking up at once. Lucas's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, and Sophie melted into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. The world around them disappeared, leaving only the sound of the gentle waves and the steady rhythm of their breathing. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie was breathless, her heart racing in her chest. Lucas's eyes were dark and full of emotion as he looked down at her, his hand still resting on her waist. "Wow," he whispered, a small, breathless laugh escaping his lips. Sophie smiled, feeling light and dizzy, like her feet had left the ground. "Yeah, wow." They stood there for a few moments, their foreheads resting against each other, letting the weight of what had just happened settle between them. Sophie's mind was spinning, but in the best possible way. She felt alive, exhilarated, and completely in the moment. Lucas was the first to speak, his voice soft and filled with something that sounded like hope. "So, what now?" Sophie let out a small laugh, still catching her breath. "I have no idea," she admitted, "but I think we're off to a pretty good start." Lucas grinned, his hand slipping into hers, their fingers interlocking naturally. "I think so too." They stood there for a while longer, watching as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in hues of deep orange and pink. The waters shimmered in the fading light, and the world around them felt both vast and intimate at the same time. Sophie knew that whatever came next, whether they stayed in this magical village or returned to the realities of their everyday lives, things between them would never be the same. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of that. In fact, she welcomed it. Because with Lucas by her side, she felt like anything was possible. The stars began to appear, twinkling in the deepening twilight, as Sophie and Lucas lingered by the fjord, their hands still intertwined. The sky had turned from soft pinks and oranges to a velvety indigo, with the first few stars reflecting off the mirror-like surface of the water. The stillness of the moment felt profound, as though the world had paused just for them. Sophie tilted her head back, her gaze tracing the constellations beginning to stretch across the sky. "Do you remember that time we went stargazing back in Oslo?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost dreamlike. Lucas glanced at her, his eyes filled with a soft nostalgia. "Of course. It was freezing, and I'm pretty sure I complained the entire time, but you made me stay to watch the meteor shower." He grinned. "You said I'd regret it if I missed it." Sophie laughed softly, the memory warming her. "You did regret it at first. I think you lost feeling in your toes that night." "I did, but you were right," he admitted, his tone sincere. "It was worth it. That was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. Until tonight." Sophie turned to look at him, her breath catching at the way his gaze lingered on her, not the stars. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and she felt that familiar warmth spreading through her. Lucas's words hung in the air between them, a quiet confession wrapped in the night. "I'm glad you think so," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle lap of the water against the shore. Lucas squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing light circles over her skin. "I've always known there was something special about us, Sophie. Even when we were just friends, it always felt different." Sophie's pulse quickened at his words. She had felt it too, that invisible thread connecting them, even when they hadn't acknowledged it. It had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "And now?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his in the dim light. Lucas stepped closer, his presence warm and steady beside her. "Now, I think we're finally seeing it for what it is." Sophie let his words wash over her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely certain about something. She had always been cautious, afraid of letting her emotions get the best of her, but with Lucas, it felt different. There was no fear here, only possibility. "I feel like I've been waiting for this without even realizing it," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Waiting for something to change between us." Lucas's gaze softened, and he cupped her face in his hands, his touch tender and reassuring. "It was always there, Sophie. We were just waiting for the right moment." She leaned into his touch, her heart full. The night wrapped around them like a cocoon, the world outside fading into insignificance. It was just them, standing by the edge of the fjord, their future stretching out before them like the vast expanse of stars above. After a long, quiet moment, Lucas leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a soft, lingering kiss. It was tender, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world to figure out where this new chapter of their lives would lead. And in that kiss, Sophie felt everything, his promise, his hope, and the unspoken understanding that they were both ready for whatever came next. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie's heart was racing, but she felt grounded, more present than she had in years. Lucas smiled at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and she couldn't help but smile back, feeling a swell of happiness rise inside her. "We should probably head back," he said, though there was no urgency in his voice. "It's getting late." Sophie nodded, though a part of her wanted to stay by the fjord a little longer, to hold on to this perfect moment. "Yeah, you're right. But I'm not ready for this night to end." Lucas's smile widened, and he gave her hand a gentle tug. "Who says it has to end? We've got time." They walked back through the woods in the dim light, the moon rising slowly above the trees, casting a soft glow over the path. The village was quiet when they returned, the streets nearly empty, save for a few distant figures. The soft hum of the evening settled over them, and with Lucas by her side, Sophie felt like she was walking through a dream. As they approached the small inn where they were staying, Lucas slowed his pace, turning to face her. The light from the inn's windows spilled onto the cobblestone street, casting their shadows long and thin behind them. "Do you want to come up to my room for a bit?" Lucas asked, his voice casual but with a hint of something more. "We could keep talking, maybe sit out on the balcony and watch the stars." Sophie hesitated for a moment, not because she didn't want to, but because of the weight of what that invitation meant. They had already crossed a line tonight, one that they couldn't uncross, but standing here now, in the quiet of the village with the promise of something new between them, she realized she didn't want to turn back. She smiled, a sense of calm settling over her. I'd like that. They made their way up to Lucas's room, and Sophie felt a nervous excitement bubbling in her chest. The room was simple, with soft, warm lighting and a small balcony that overlooked the fjord. Lucas opened the door to the balcony, letting in the cool night air, and they stepped outside together. The view was breathtaking. The fjord shimmered under the moonlight, and the stars above seemed to go on forever. Sophie leaned against the railing, gazing out at the expanse of water, her heart full. Lucas joined her, his arm brushing against hers, and for a while they just stood there, side by side, soaking in the beauty of the night. I could get used to this, Lucas said quietly, his voice filled with contentment. Being here with you. Sophie turned to him, her smile soft. Me too. They stood there, bathed in the glow of the moon and stars, and in that moment, Sophie knew they had begun something special. It was more than just the magic of the trip or the beauty of the place. It was them, together, finally stepping into something they had been unknowingly waiting for all along. As the night deepened and the world around them fell into a quiet slumber, Sophie realized that no matter what happened next, she had found something real. Something worth holding on to. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of where it might lead. The days following that magical night by the fjord were filled with an easy rhythm of quiet moments and shared laughter, as if Sophie and Lucas had always been meant to be together. They explored the small villages along the fjord, wandered through ancient forests, and spent lazy afternoons by the water, their hands almost always intertwined. But as their time in Nordfjordeid came to a close, reality began to seep in. The fleeting nature of the trip hung over them, a gentle reminder that soon they would have to return to their separate lives in Oslo, to the routines that had once seemed so comfortable but now felt incomplete without each other. On the last night of their stay, Sophie sat on the balcony of their room, wrapped in a blanket, gazing out at the fjord that had become so familiar. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the water, and the air was filled with the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore. It was peaceful, but a soft ache had settled in her chest, knowing that their time here was almost over. Lucas stepped out onto the balcony, joining her in the quiet. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her, his arm brushing hers as he too looked out at the fjord. For a moment, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be, like they could stay in this perfect bubble forever. But Sophie knew they couldn't. She knew that tomorrow would come, and with it, the inevitable return to the lives they had left behind. And though she hadn't said it out loud, the fear of what might happen next weighed on her. What if this magic between them faded once they returned to Oslo? What if their relationship couldn't survive outside the beauty and tranquility of this place? Lucas seemed to sense her unease. He shifted beside her, turning to face her fully, his eyes soft and full of understanding. "I've been thinking," he began quietly, his voice carrying a note of seriousness, "about what happens when we leave here." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She met his gaze, trying to read the emotions swirling in his eyes. "I have too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like everything could change once we go back." Lucas nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah, I know. It scares me too, to be honest. But I don't want what we've found, to disappear just because we're not in this place anymore." Sophie felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest. "Neither do I." Lucas reached for her hand, his fingers warm and familiar as they intertwined with hers. He held her gaze, his expression serious but filled with a quiet determination. "I don't know what the future holds, Sophie, but I know that I don't want to go back to the way things were before this trip. Not without you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat at his words. She hadn't realized just how much she had needed to hear that until now. "You mean?" "I mean," Lucas continued, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of her hand, "I want to make this work. Even when we're back in Oslo, with our jobs and routines and all the noise of everyday life. I want us to work." Sophie felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief and joy. For so long, she had been afraid of taking that leap, of trusting that something real and lasting could come out of this whirlwind romance. But looking at Lucas now, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She didn't have to let doubt and fear hold her back from the happiness that was right in front of her. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice steady. "I want to figure this out, no matter what it takes." Lucas smiled then, a slow, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes and made Sophie's heart flutter. "Then we will," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We'll figure it out together." Sophie smiled back, a sense of peace settling over her. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as they both gazed out at the moonlit fjord. The uncertainty of the future no longer felt so daunting, not with Lucas by her side. They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around them as the stars twinkled overhead. Everything about this moment felt right, as though all the twists and turns of their lives had led them here, to each other. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice soft and thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about something else too." Sophie looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What's that?" Lucas glanced out at the fjord, then back at her, his smile playful yet sincere. "Maybe we don't have to leave it all behind. Maybe we could find a way to keep this feeling, this peace, alive even when we're back in the city. We could come back here, make it our place." Sophie blinked, surprised but touched by the suggestion. "You mean like a tradition? A way to reconnect?" Lucas nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah. Whenever things get too hectic, too overwhelming, we could come back to this spot, to Nordfjordeid. A reminder of where it all began." Sophie's heart warmed at the thought. It felt perfect, like a promise that they could always return to this place, to each other, no matter what life threw at them. "I love that idea," she said, her voice full of emotion. Lucas leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, and Sophie closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of the moment. They had found something special here, something that went beyond the magic of the fjords and the beauty of the trip. They had found each other, in a way they hadn't expected, but were now ready to embrace fully. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophie felt a sense of certainty settle over her. No matter where life took them, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, they would always have this. They would always have each other. And in that moment, with the stars shining bright above them and the gentle sound of the fjord in the background, Sophie knew that this was just the beginning of their story. A story filled with love, adventure, and the promise of a future they would face together. The end was just the beginning.